Margaret sat at the dining table, the sound of the clock ticking louder than usual. Emily had just called to say she'd be late from work. That meant Margaret was left with Daniel, her daughter's husband, for dinner. She didn't think much of it at first. Daniel was part of the family now, someone she trusted. She poured him another glass of water, and they began eating in the quiet glow of the dining room light. At first, their conversation was simple. They spoke about Emily's work schedule, the cold autumn air creeping into the city, and the football game Daniel had been following. Margaret laughed at one of his jokes, surprised by how easy it felt to talk with him. She noticed how relaxed his smile looked, how comfortable he seemed in her company. That in itself was not unusual. Daniel had always been polite, always tried to fit in. But tonight felt different. As Margaret cleared the plates, she turned and caught his gaze. His eyes weren't distracted or casual. They were focused. It wasn't an inappropriate look, not something she could accuse him of, but there was a weight in it, a kind of quiet intensity. She felt her chest tighten as if the air had shifted. Quickly, she brushed it aside. Surely she was imagining it. She was tired, and maybe reading too much into an innocent glance. But then, when she returned with dessert, she saw it again. Daniel's eyes lingered, softer this time, as though he was studying her without words. Margaret's heart beat faster. She forced herself to look away, busying her hands with the plates, her mind racing. Why did it feel like the room had grown smaller? Why did it feel like silence had suddenly become louder than words? Trying to steady herself, she reminded herself who he was, her daughter's husband. That truth alone should have erased whatever strange flutter stirred inside her. Still, when he thanked her for dinner and smiled warmly, Margaret found herself unable to ignore the thought that something had shifted. It wasn't spoken. It wasn't planned, but it was there, like a quiet spark in the shadows. That night, when she lay in bed, Margaret replayed the evening in her mind. The way their conversation had flowed so easily, the way he had listened carefully when she spoke, the way his eyes had stayed on her longer than they should have. She turned onto her side, closing her eyes tightly, telling herself it was nothing. But deep down, she knew the feeling wasn't going to disappear so easily. And that was the moment she realized. Life was about to change in a way she had never expected. Margaret tried to forget that strange night, but the memory clung to her like a shadow. She kept reminding herself that Daniel was Emily's husband, not someone she should ever think about twice. Still, the human heart is stubborn. Days turned into weeks, and though she acted normal, she found herself watching her steps more carefully. She avoided being alone with him, yet life kept placing them in the same room. One Saturday, Emily invited her parents for dinner at their home. Margaret helped in the kitchen while Emily went upstairs to grab something. Daniel came in to check on the food, and suddenly it was just the two of them. He leaned casually against the counter, asked about her week, and the conversation was simple, ordinary, but his eyes never left hers. Margaret felt it again, that quiet pull, as if there were words hanging unspoken between them. She quickly excused herself, saying she needed to set the table, but her hands trembled slightly as she carried the dishes out. Another time, Daniel came to fix a leaky faucet at Margaret's house while Emily was at work. Margaret told herself it was nothing, just a son-in-law helping his wife's mother. But as she watched him work, his sleeves rolled up, focused and patient, she felt something stir in her chest. When he looked up and smiled at her, she had to turn away, pretending to tidy the counter so he wouldn't see the rush of warmth on her face. It became a pattern. Small, ordinary moments suddenly carried weight. Passing him a plate at dinner, walking side by side to the car, or laughing at the same joke, it all felt sharper, more alive, more dangerous. Daniel never said anything inappropriate, never crossed a line, but there was something in his eyes that Margaret couldn't ignore. It wasn't disrespectful, but it wasn't casual either. It was as if he saw her, not just as Emily's mother, but as a woman. Margaret hated herself for noticing. She would go home and sit quietly, scolding her own thoughts. She loved her daughter. Emily deserved happiness, and Daniel was her husband. That was the end of it. But the harder she tried to push it away, the more the feelings pressed back. At night, lying awake, She would remember how his voice softened when he spoke to her, how his smile lingered when their eyes met. One evening, Margaret invited Emily and Daniel over for dinner. After they ate, Emily stepped outside to take a work call, leaving Margaret and Daniel in the living room. The silence stretched. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, telling herself not to look up, not to speak. But Daniel broke the quiet with a gentle comment. "You remind me of where Emily gets her kindness," he said softly. The words were harmless, but the tone carried something more. Margaret's breath caught. She looked at him, and in his eyes she saw it again, that silent honesty. Her heart raced, her cheeks grew warm, and she whispered quickly, "Daniel, you shouldn't say things like that." He didn't argue. He only nodded as though he understood, and the room fell back into silence. Emily returned moments later, cheerful and unaware, filling the space with her easy laughter. But Margaret couldn't shake the weight of what had just passed between her and Daniel. That night, Margaret stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street. She knew she had to control her heart, to stop this before it became something dangerous. Yet, deep down, she admitted something she had been too afraid to say even to herself. She was beginning to feel something she should never feel. Emily's birthday came on a cool spring evening. Margaret had been in the kitchen since morning, preparing food, arranging flowers, making sure every corner of the house looked perfect. Friends and relatives filled the living room, laughter spilled into the hallway, and music played softly in the background. Emily glowed with happiness, moving from guest to guest, her hand often tucked into Daniel's. Margaret watched them and felt a warm pride, reminding herself this was what mattered, her daughter's joy. But hours of entertaining wore her down. She slipped quietly into the garden, needing air. The night was calm, the sky clear, and the porch light cast a soft circle on the path. She leaned against the railing, closing her eyes for a moment, just breathing. That's when she heard footsteps. Daniel stepped out, holding a glass of water. "Thought you could use this," he said kindly. Margaret accepted it with a polite smile. "Thank you. It's been a long day." For a moment, they stood side by side, listening to the faint sound of voices and laughter drifting through the open windows. The quiet was heavy, almost too heavy, and Margaret felt her heart tighten. She knew she should go back inside, yet her feet stayed rooted to the spot. Daniel broke the silence. "You always take care of everyone." "Tonight, too. You've been on your feet since morning, making sure everyone is happy, but no one asks if you're okay." Margaret turned her head quickly, startled by the softness in his tone. She wanted to dismiss his words, laugh them off, but something in his eyes held her still. They were calm, steady, and far too tender. Her throat tightened. She looked away, gripping the glass tighter. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "You shouldn't say things like that." "I know," he replied quietly, his voice carrying no defense, no excuse. "But it's the truth." The words landed between them like a confession neither had asked for. Margaret felt her pulse race. She wasn't a young girl anymore. She had lived long enough to understand the danger of moments like this. She should have turned and walked back into the house immediately. But for a heartbeat longer, she stayed. And in that heartbeat, she let herself feel what she had been denying, the warmth in his gaze, the pull in her own chest, the sharp ache of something forbidden yet undeniable. The garden light flickered slightly, and the sound of Emily's laughter rang out from inside. That sound jolted Margaret back to herself. She placed the glass down on the railing and stepped back. "We should go in," she said firmly, forcing a calm smile. Daniel didn't argue. He only nodded, his expression quiet, almost resigned. Together they walked back inside, their steps slow, their silence heavy. Emily greeted them cheerfully, linking her arm through Daniel's without noticing the storm that had passed in the garden. Margaret spent the rest of the evening smiling, laughing when needed, moving from guest to guest as though nothing had happened. But inside she was trembling. For the first time, she admitted the truth she had tried so hard to deny. There was something between her and Daniel, something neither of them had chosen, but something that had taken root all the same. When the last guest left and the house finally quieted, Margaret stood by the sink, washing dishes with steady hands. But her heart was far from steady. She replayed the garden in her mind, his voice, his eyes, her own weakness. She told herself it had to end here, that this was a moment to bury forever. Yet even as she promised herself that, she knew the memory would stay. It would live quietly inside her, a secret truth she could never share. The weeks after Emily's birthday moved forward like any other, but for Margaret, nothing felt the same. The garden moment had left a mark she could not erase. She busied herself with chores, visited neighbors more often, and filled her evenings with books and television just to keep her mind from drifting back. But no matter how hard she tried, Daniel's words echoed in her memory. Sometimes the truth shows in ways we can't control. Daniel, too, seemed quieter. At family dinners, he was polite, respectful, but the easy laughter they once shared was gone. He kept his distance, and Margaret was grateful for it, though his silence carried just as much weight as his words once had. Emily never noticed. She was bright, focused on her career, always speaking about new projects, new plans for the future. Margaret watched her daughter's joy and told herself that was all that mattered. One evening, Emily invited Margaret over for Sunday lunch. The three of them sat around the table, sunlight streaming in through the windows. The meal was filled with chatter about work, about a vacation Emily wanted to plan. Margaret smiled, nodded, and tried to keep her attention only on her daughter. But when Daniel reached to pass her the bread, their hands brushed for the briefest moment. A simple accident, nothing more, but the jolt of awareness ran through her. She pulled her hand back quickly, pretending to adjust her napkin, her heart unsteady. That night, Margaret sat alone in her room, staring at the photograph on her dresser. Emily and Daniel on their wedding day, faces glowing with happiness. The picture was a reminder of the promise they had made to each other, a promise Margaret had no right to interfere with. Tears stung her eyes, not from guilt alone, but from the sharp ache of what she felt inside. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted it, but her heart had betrayed her. From that night on, Margaret made her choice. She would protect Emily's happiness at all costs. That meant silence. That meant keeping her feelings locked away, never spoken, never acted on. She would be the mother her daughter deserved, not a woman foolish enough to ruin what her child had built. The weeks turned into months. Life settled into its rhythm again. Margaret attended family gatherings, smiled in photographs, and joined her daughter for coffee on weekends. Whenever Daniel was there, she kept conversations polite, short, and light. They never spoke of that night in the garden, never let their eyes linger too long. Whatever had passed between them was sealed away, unspoken, buried beneath the surface of everyday life. And yet, in quiet moments, when she walked through the garden alone, when she poured herself a late cup of tea, when she stood by her window watching the city lights, Margaret thought of him. Not with anger, not even with regret, but with a bittersweet ache. She wondered what might have been if life had been different, if Daniel had not been Emily's husband, if she had met him in another time, another story. But those thoughts were only shadows, and shadows could not change reality. Margaret carried her secret like a hidden scar. No one saw it, no one asked about it, but it lived inside her. She learned to smile through it, learned to let her daughter's joy be enough. Because love, she realized, was not always about following the heart. Sometimes love was sacrifice. Sometimes it meant silence. Sometimes it meant choosing what was right, even when it hurt. And so she chose silence. She chose her daughter's happiness. She chose dignity over desire. But even as she lived with that choice, she knew there would always be nights when she closed her eyes and remembered the way he had looked at her in the garden, the honesty in his voice, the kindness in his eyes, and the moment that had changed everything, even if it remained forever unspoken. It was a memory she would carry quietly, a story she would never tell, a truth hidden in her heart. And though she walked forward with grace, she knew some part of her would always wonder what might have been. If only things had been different.